Welcome everyone to the inaugural Juneteenth celebration for Fielding Graduate University. I hope that this is the first celebration of many for many decades to come. Good morning to you all in certain time zones, good afternoon and evening to others. Thank you all for joining us. As you probably know, my name is Katrina Rogers and I'm president of Fielding Graduate University, and really looking forward to our time together today to commemorate Juneteenth. We invited, of course, our global Fielding learning community today, but we've also invited friends and family, colleagues, because we thought this moment in history was that important to bring anyone together who wanted to be here. Here in the US and in many countries around the world, Juneteenth will be observed on Sunday, June 19th, and in some cases on Monday, June 20th. But the spirit of Juneteenth is global, and I think you'll see that today in the various remarks by our participants. Historians tell us that Juneteenth marks the day in 1865 when enslaved Black people in Galveston, Texas, which was then the most remote region of the Confederacy, they received news that they were now legally free. And keep in mind that this was news that came to them 2.5 years after President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But to enslaved people in the United States, there was no one moment or singular day when freedom came. And that is why for us at Fielding, Juneteenth is also a time of commemoration, because it does mark a moment in the struggle for freedom, liberation, and emancipation. And at the same time, the occasion is an opportunity for all of us to reflect on the contributions of Black Americans, then and now, to the cause of human freedom. I'd like you to remember the name of Opal Lee. At 95, Lee is now retired, but in large measure, we have this fellow educator and social justice activist to thank for ensuring that Juneteenth received federal designation. For her, it was a journey that began in 2016 when she was then 89. She made national news. And I remember reading stories about this diminutive woman with a big mission. She was figuratively and literally on a long road to bring attention to the cause in which she believed. And at the time I read about Miss Lee, I thought about her as a quintessential lifelong learner, very much a value of the Fielding community. She put on her sneakers and she trekked from her home in Fort Worth, Texas to Washington, D.C., which was 1,400 miles, to make the case for a national Juneteenth holiday. In 2021, Opal Lee was successful, and she is regarded as the grandmother of Juneteenth. She succeeded. So today is Fielding's turn to celebrate Juneteenth and to pay homage to those who continue to make great strides towards freedom for all. We have an excellent group of presenters who you will hear from shortly, and among them is Fielding alum, Dr. Beverly Stevenson, who earned her PhD in Human Development in 2013. Based in Houston, Texas, Dr. Stevenson is president and CEO of the Mollie Taylor Stevenson Sr. and Heirs Incorporated, which is her family's partnership in business. I had the pleasure of getting to know Dr. Stevenson at my very first research session at Fielding. It was in the Human and Organization Development Program in the spring of 2006. It was in Houston and just after Hurricane Katrina. And as many of you know, Houston was also deeply affected, particularly the school systems, because so many from New Orleans went to Houston for help and support. Fielding faculty and students created a 2-day panel on the impact of Hurricane Katrina on education in that community. And it was such a tumultuous time. And I just remember how everyone stepped up to present a thoughtful collection of reflections of how systems can develop resilience in the face of sudden change, as well as address leadership challenges. And as a person who lived in Houston, Beverly was part of our time together, and I got to know her then. And as being a new member of the Fielding community, she was a student, among others, who I was just so impressed with. And the other thing I remember is that Dr. Stevenson invited all her research participants to her final oral review, which is Fielding's term for the dissertation defense. I was so moved by them and Beverly's respect and understanding of the gift that they gave her to support her critical research, which you're about to experience some of. So we're so pleased to have you here, Dr. Stevenson, as our keynote speaker, and welcome back to this event, and welcome to this event. In addition, she's joined by two fielding leaders, Dr. Allison Davis White-Eyes, Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and Dr. Orlando Taylor, the Distinguished Senior Advisor to the President and the Director of the Marie Fielder Center for Democracy, Leadership, and Education. And not only is Dr. Taylor the director of that center, he's also the co-founder and really the person who brought the legacy of Dr. Marie Fielder to Fielding. We're so proud to have you both with us today as well. Some of you know Dr. Davis White-Eyes, but if not, she joined Fielding last October, and she's already introduced so many initiatives to Fielding, such as University State of Diversity, the Search Advocate Training Program for our staff and faculty, and also monthly reflections on significant heritage celebrations, and also this event. So thank you, Dr. Davis White-Eyes, for all that you've done for us thus far in really elevating these conversations and creating the space for them in our community. You will be making a global land acknowledgement, and this is another significant tradition we now observe at Fielding. So Dr. Davis White-Eyes, I turn the mic over to you. And thank you all, and again, welcome.
There we go.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Rogers, for those opening remarks.
Oh, excuse me, Dr. Taylor. I'm so sorry. Dr. Davis White-Eyes wanted to say something first.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you so much, President Rogers, for that wonderful introduction, and welcome everyone to our inaugural Juneteenth celebration. It is truly an honor to bear witness to this day on so many levels. First, on a personal level, as the descendant of enslaved and indigenous peoples, this event has a very special meaning. And second, as a community committed to social justice, this event holds us all accountable to our history and to our actions. Before I proceed any further, however, it is important to acknowledge that the history of enslavement and liberation took place and continues to take place on indigenous land. We are still witnessing the historic and systemic ways in which indigenous peoples are still fighting for recognition and liberation. In this spirit, let us take time to acknowledge the land. As we think about our land acknowledgement, let us recognize that the headquarters of Fielding Graduate University resides currently on the lands of the coastal band of Chumash people. In addition, we also acknowledge the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtonk and the Piscataway and Pamunkey people in the Washington, D.C. area, where some of our other Fielding offices are located, as well as some of our speakers. And last, we wish to acknowledge the fact that Fielding is a distributed learning campus, and as such, we acknowledge indigenous lands the world over. I encourage you to search on this link that I am dropping into the chat to identify the indigenous lands upon which you reside. We encourage you to do this so that you can take the time to reflect on liberation, recognition, and emancipation, and acknowledge the fact that indigenous history and the history of Black Americans are inextricably tied together in this land. Thank you. At this time, please also allow me to introduce our beloved colleague and mentor, Dr. Orlando Taylor, who will be serving as the event moderator and who will share a few words on the significance of this event. Dr. Taylor is the director of the Marie Fielder Center for Democracy, Leadership, and Education, and is the distinguished senior advisor to the president of Fielding Graduate University. As a proud alumnus of an HBCU, Dr. Taylor holds many academic accomplishments. He has and continues to be a national leader on issues pertaining to diversity and inclusion in higher education, including serving as chair of the prestigious National Council of Graduate Schools. He has been a particularly vigorous advocate and spokesperson on topics relating to access and equity in higher education, and on preparing the next generation of researchers, leaders, and faculty members for the nation's colleges and universities. Dr. Taylor is a co-principal investigator and ED for a major National Science Foundation project to conduct research and advance the development of a new generation of leaders in the STEM fields throughout the United States, including HBCUs. Fielding is proud to be a part of his work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Orlando Taylor.
Thank you, Dr. Davis White Eyes, and welcome everyone for this wonderful occasion, this time for renewal and recommitment. Remember that context matters. And so therefore we need to really remind ourselves of what happened with respect to the Emancipation Proclamation. Some historical facts. Abraham Lincoln signed the preliminary version on September 22nd, 1862, and it became effective January 1, 1863. It freed all slaves in the Confederate States. But an important point is, it did not free slaves in the non-Confederate states where slavery still existed. For example, in Kentucky, in Maryland, and Delaware. A word about freeing the slaves in Texas. It did not occur until June 19th, 1865, nearly 9 decades after the nation's founding in 1776. It's more than 2 years after President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 during the Civil War. The Civil War had ended in September when Robert E. Lee had surrendered in Appomattox, on April 9th, 1865, not 1965. And you perhaps all remember the general orders that were read in Galveston, Texas, when the US troops arrived. Quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free." But like many things in history, there are myths, and there are myths about Juneteenth. I would like to explore a few of them with you. For example, one myth is Juneteenth was the official ending of slavery. As I said a moment ago, the fact is, not in states that were not a part of the Confederacy. Example, Delaware and Kentucky. Slaves in those states were not officially emancipated until the 13th Amendment of the Constitution was passed, December 18th in 1865. Another myth. Juneteenth is the oldest celebration in the African American community to celebrate the end of slavery. In fact, the oldest celebration of the end of slavery took place in Galveston, Ohio on September 22nd in 1863. And in fact, Black churches celebrated something called Watch Night in many locations on the eve of January 1, 1863. Another myth. People in Texas didn't know about the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, in fact, it was known. The Texas Confederate Constitution prohibited manumission. And on January 14th, 1863, for example, a newspaper in Houston reported that the resolution endorsing Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was adopted in the Federal House of Representatives 78-51. In fact, more than 100 Texas newspapers mentioned the Emancipation Proclamation between 1862 and 1864. Another myth. Blacks all over the country have historically celebrated Juneteenth. Fact? Well, the celebration originally celebrated in Texas and in all locales where Black Texans migrated. In my own lifetime, for example, I never knew about Juneteenth until I was into my early 50s. I lived in Tennessee, a state that was not close to Texas, and where slavery was abolished at the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. So those are just a few myths. It's important to know history to really understand facts so that when we celebrate in the context of facts. Now, it is important for us in this day of reflection to recognize that Juneteenth did not end racism, segregation, terrorism, or discrimination against African Americans. Post-slavery Black codes, for example, they were enacted after the Emancipation Proclamation, limited freedom of African Americans and ensured them as cheap labor throughout the former slave states. Also, there was the rise of something called scientific racism. Scientific racism, where scholars, I guess I should put scholars in quotes, promulgated many racist notions about African Americans, things like eugenics, for instance, and the bell curve. I've given a reference in the slides from the Smithsonian Magazine, which speaks to the scientific racism, how science has been used to justify racism. 1896, we had Plessy versus Ferguson in the US Supreme Court, which upheld separate but equal. And then, of course, in the early 20th century, Ku Klux Klan activity, the founding of the Ku Klux Klan, lynchings, Jim Crow laws, terrorism. One only has to think about the Tulsa massacre, for example. These things all occurred in the 20th century. Later, in 1953, the Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education lawsuit was upheld in the US Supreme Court, which officially outlawed school segregation in the country, but school segregation continued for another 15 to 20 years throughout the United States. And of course, today, we still have voter suppression, police brutality, these acts continue despite the civil rights and voting rights laws of 1960s. This is not to rain on the parade of Juneteenth, but it's a sharp reminder that Juneteenth did not end racism in our country, or segregation, or terrorism, or discrimination against African Americans, and it continues to this very day. Next slide, please. And so we know that in 2021, almost a year ago, tomorrow actually be 1 year, the White House proclaimed the occasion of the first celebration of Juneteenth as a federal holiday. President Biden read a proclamation. It read in part, on Juneteenth, we recommit ourselves to the work of equity, equality, and justice. And we celebrate the centuries of struggle, courage, and hope that have brought us to this time of progress and possibility. That work has been led throughout our history by abolitionists and educators, civil rights advocates and lawyers, courageous activists and trade unionists, public officials, and everyday Americans who have helped make real the ideals of our founding documents for all. Great nations don't ignore the most painful chapters of their past. Great nations confront them, come to terms with them. Juneteenth, therefore, for us at Fielding and throughout the country really should be a time for reflection and a time for renewal. It's a time for us to learn from our past and own it as a backdrop for building a just future. And that is a part of our mission at this university. Another point we can make is that we must continue to do the work. We emphasize the word work that's required to make the American dream and the Fielding dream possible beyond slogans and cosmetic fixes. And finally, let us reimagine and reinvent social justice, freedom, and democracy in the nation, our communities, and at Fielding. And at this point, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Beverly J. Dorsey Stevenson, daughter of Paul Dorsey Jr. And Hester Catherine Dorsey grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. She grew up during the Civil Rights Movement. At a time, by the way, Dr. Stevenson, I was an intern at the VA hospital on Zorn Avenue in Louisville. I'm sure you know that hospital. And I was there at the time of the Brown Hotel desegregation efforts. I was there as a college student. She grew up in Louisville, became one of the first African-American students to integrate Benjamin Franklin Elementary School when her 3-room school, the Benjamin Banneker Elementary School, closed. Her parents were strong advocates for justice. And after she finished elementary and high school in Louisville, she went on to Western Kentucky University, where she was among the first 50 African-American students to integrate that university in Bowling Green. Again, she confronted inequities and racial hostility. She collaborated with other students of color, Black students, to establish the WKU Black Student Union to fight campus racism. She's not new to this effort for real, true social justice in our society. She was awarded a music scholarship to study the violin and became the first Black member of the Western Kentucky University Symphony Orchestra. She began her career in Baltimore, Maryland at the YWCA. Her mentor, Grace Hunt, encouraged active participation in women's leadership training at the local and national level, conducted by none other than a well-known person, they should be a well-known person to most of us, Dorothy Height at the National Council for Negro Women in Washington, D.C. She's an outstanding individual in many ways. She holds 2 master's degrees in planning and administration, first from Antioch University, and then in human and organizational systems at Fielding, where she also acquired a PhD in human development. We're honored today on this first occasion in recognition of Juneteenth to welcome Dr. Beverly J. Dorsey Stevenson. Dr. Stevenson, would you please?
Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor, for that wonderful introduction. It kind of made me a little bit emotional because you do so many things over your life, but when you hear it, then you realize the impact that you have made. I also thank Dr. Katrina Rogers for your visionary leadership at Fielding Graduate University and your commitment to freedom and justice for all, as well as Dr. Allison Davis White Eyes, VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Elena Nicholson, Director of Development and Community Relations, Brian Lopes and your wonderful technical team, Hillary Lynn, Director of Alumni Relations, my mentor, Dr. Barbara P. Mink, who I saw on the line, Dean of, Dean of the School of Leadership Studies, and everyone, I'd like to thank everyone who conceptualized and actualized this fantastic day. I also extend gratitude to my family, my friends, colleagues from across the country and around the world, and my Texas cluster and sorors of Delta Sigma Theta Eta Zeta. Thank you all for coming to celebrate with us. I'm humbled, I'm honored to be your speaker on this beautiful occasion and proud to be a lifelong learner in Fielding global community where everyone activates, agitates, and advocates social justice, equality, diversity, inclusion, and truth, not alternative facts. So now I'd like to share with you a couple of videos, and we will go into the origins of Juneteenth.
Juneteenth is an annual holiday commemorating the end of slavery in the United States. The name Juneteenth combines the words June and 19th to honor a historical date.
On June 19th, 1865, a Union general named Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas to read a proclamation called Order Number 3 to inform the good people of Texas that, as per the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, all enslaved people were free. It let people know that there would be absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between masters, former masters, and former slaves. It said you will now have an official relationship between former master and slave as employer and hired labor.
More than 250,000 slaves in Texas had a right to freedom. The message, however, came more than 2 years after President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863.
The Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved people in the Confederacy. It did not deal with those who were enslaved in Union territory.
The Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in the U.S. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except as a punishment for crime in 1865. The proclamation was intended to cripple the Confederacy's use of slaves in the Civil War effort. Under the measure, if a seceded state chose to return to the Union before January 1st, the state would not have to make slavery illegal. But if the state refused to return, then enslaved people would be free.
Free labor is what this country is built on. Enslavers did not want to free their slaves.
The freedom promised to slaves in rebellious states through the proclamation depended on the Union military defeating the Confederacy. For the enslaved, it turned into a war for freedom. Almost 200,000 Black soldiers and sailors served for the Union.
The figurehead is always the story of Gordon Granger. They're bringing the story, the reality that, yes, the Civil War is over and the Confederacy has lost. But that doesn't mean that Texans, white Texans, wanted to give up the bondage, the free labor.
Slaves fought to secure their own liberty. In the South, slaves had to struggle for freedom through self-liberation or intervention from Union forces.
There were beatings, there were lynchings, shootings as people tried to take their own freedom. You could only celebrate so much. They were de facto enslaved, and many stayed in bondage because of threat of violence.
Juneteenth was originally recognized in Texas on June 19, 1866, before spreading to other states. It typically included prayer services, inspirational messages, stories from former slaves, food, dance, and much more.
Initially, when we talk about the first Juneteenth celebrations in 1866, there's a rejoicing. But because of the oppression, Jim Crow era, the rise of white supremacy on the back of Black freedom, you had a suppression of those exuberant expressions of joy at freedom. But as you moved into the Civil Rights era, you started to see a sense of Black pride and Black power emerging. And through that, you had this rebirth of the celebration of Juneteenth in the 20th and then subsequently in the 21st century today. Juneteenth should be recognized because it is an historical moment. It is not just for Texans. It is for Californians, it's for people everywhere. You don't have to be a person of color to celebrate Juneteenth either. You just have to be a person who wants to celebrate.
Unbeknownst to me, my research journey actually began April the 3rd, 1983, on a beautiful Easter Sunday afternoon when I married Major William Stevenson Sr. It was not long before intriguing stories began to emerge about the interracial relationship of his great-grandparents, Edward Ruthven Taylor, known as E.R., and Ann George, who later became Ann Taylor. Over the course of our 25-year marriage, Major and I had countless thought-provoking theoretical conversations about the lives of E.R. and Ann. I don't know what we found most interesting, the origin of the interracial couple and how his family emerged from white to Black, their mulatto children, or their land, their place, known by many Houstonians as The Ranch, 8 miles from downtown, 3 miles south of NRG Stadium, In 1989, Major and I collaborated with his mother, Mollie Taylor Stevenson Sr. The research focused on the land, the original 640-acre E.R. Taylor estate, which was inducted into the Texas Department of Agriculture's Family Land Heritage Program for over 100 years of continuous use by one family for farm and ranch purposes. Major established the name Taylor Stevenson Ranch. However, the official name recorded in the Harris County deeds and records is the E.R. Taylor Estate. Today, the Taylor Stevenson Ranch and American Cowboy Museum are educational programs operated on 2 acres by Mollie Stevenson Jr., Executive Director. The E.R. Taylor Estate has sustained for 7 generations, 143 years after its founding by E.R. and Ann Taylor in 1870. Mollie Taylor Stevenson Sr. operated the E.R. Taylor Estate for more than 50 years. Major and I worked with Mollie Sr. for 25 years to sustain the estate. Until this research and dissertation, the untold true story, the taboo interracial relationship of Edward Ruthven Taylor, slave broker's son, and Ann George Taylor, former slave in Houston, Texas, had not been documented using a scholarly, social, scientific approach. Tidbits of the lives of E.R. and Ann have been published. After numerous misquotes, my mother-in-law, Mollie Stevenson Sr., also known as Big Mollie, finally said to Major and me, "You folk write the story and get it right." So during the tragic 9/11 World Trade Center attack, I enrolled in the Human and Organizational Development Doctoral Program at Fielding Graduate University in Santa Barbara, California. Major served as a historian on my dissertation team and also became the family historian in 2003. During the course of my research journey, Major and I had the privilege of getting to know Dr. John Hope Franklin. Dr. Franklin authored numerous best-selling books, most notably Slavery to Freedom. John Hope Franklin, his brother Buck Franklin, and Mollie Taylor Stevenson Sr. attended Fisk University in the early 1930s. John Hope Franklin encouraged the research and had vivid, fond memories of visits with the Taylors of Pierce Junction during the 30s and 40s. Major died on March 15, 2009, before this research was completed, and Dr. John Hope Franklin died 10 days later on March 25, 2009. African Americans of African and Anglo descent, with the ability to trace their lineage to 1642 England and slavery, is rare. A significant element of the social context for the relationship between E.R. and Ann Taylor is the ancestral line of E.R. Taylor. Although the family traces its ancestry to English nobility, the first American Taylor, Reverend Edward Taylor, and the first African American Taylor, Ann George Taylor, are equally significant occurrences in the Taylor family history. The Taylor family origin in England is well documented. The white Taylor history established a context necessary to the application of an analytical model. The model illustrates how an elite early white American family allowed an interracial relationship in their family. Also explained is how that union manifested the characteristics of taboo. The research of Donald E. Stanford, Reverend Edward Taylor, and Ellen Robbins Redd contributed substantially to this study. E.R. Taylor's life began at his birth on August 22, 1845, in Independence, Texas. Ann George Taylor's life began when Edward Willis Taylor purchased her as a slave, domestic servant, and cook in 1856. The lives of Edward Ruthven Taylor and Ann George Taylor changed forever on the outskirts of Houston with their 3/12 mulatto infant girl, Pinky Elizabeth, in 1870. I dedicate this study to those who started this research journey with me, but since passed away. My husband, Major William Stevenson Sr., mother-in-law, Mollie Taylor Stevenson Sr., Dr. John Hope Franklin, and Ellen Robbins Redd.
I hope you enjoyed that research journey. Scott Wharton, who is the film producer and owner of Lynette Integrated Services and videographer at University of Houston, is on the call today, and I thank Scott for that wonderful piece. I would be remiss, before I get into the taboo relationship theorists, I would be remiss if I failed to pay homage to Dr. John H. Stanfield II, renowned sociologist, ethnographer, and leading authority on African and African American studies. Dr. Stanford is celebrating with us today from Mauritius. He is a Republic of Mauritius resident now and founder of the Institute for Advanced Study of African Renaissance Policies and Ideas, and he's the chair of African Studies at University of Mauritius. Also, emeritus professor at Indiana University Bloomington and former Fielding professor. And I thank you so much, Dr. Stanfield, for your compassionate, firm leadership throughout my research journey. And before I get into the theories, I also applaud Fielding for recognizing the importance of my dissertation and recruiting Dr. Stanfield to contextualize my dissertation and guide me through the complexities of social taboo theory and the volumes of literature on taboo and interracialism, which I will present just in a second. But first, I have to also acknowledge two more of my committee members, Stephen Murphy Shigematsu, Dr. Yvonne Walker, and my dissertation readers and editors, Dr. Betty Jean Roberts and Terry Thompson Walsh, both former colleagues of mine at the University of Houston. So anyway, who are the theorists? The early theorists were William Want, William Robertson Smith, Sigmund Freud, Sir James George Fraser, Claude Lévi-Strauss, A.R. Radcliffe Brown, and contemporary interracialism theorists that I studied were Robin Goodwin, Duncan Kramer, Steve Duck, Lisa Vandervoort, and Pamela Regan. So we can now go to the next. Taboo, as defined by the theorist. First, the word taboo in and of itself is derived from the Polynesian word taboo, which means forbidden or prohibited. William Want, psychologist, founder of the first psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany, defined the cultural effect of taboo. Want said, taboo is the oldest unwritten code of laws. It generally is supposed that taboo is older than God's, and it dates back to a period before religion existed. If we are to understand taboo in accordance with the general meaning of the word, every prohibition, whether laid down in custom, usage, or explicitly formulated in laws against touching objects or making use for one's own purposes, or against using certain prescribed words, such as we are hearing today, don't say gay, there can be no race and no level of culture which has escaped the ill effects of taboo. The primitive belief is the object touch holds a demonic power, and that can take vengeance upon the person who touches it or uses it unlawfully, as characterized by Want. Unconsciously objectified fear of the demonic power. Sound familiar? Objectified fear. Want studied the punitive conditions of the Australian savages, as opposed to the higher culture. James George Fraser, Scottish social anthropologist, defined taboo as a prohibited action or use of an object based on ritualistic distinctions of them. He said, either they are sacred and consecrated or dangerous, unclean. He proposed the classifications of taboo in the three classes: tabooed acts, tabooed persons, in today's world, fences around cultures, guideposts. and place with the ability to inform, whether through inclusion or exclusion of who we are. Fraser conducted the first systematic investigation of taboo in his article, Taboo, in the 19th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1886, when he began his studies. However, after were but one of many systems of superstitions, and all initially it was thought that these taboos were only relevant to people of color, Black and brown. In elements we describe, they manifest themselves in elements that we describe today as religious, social, political, economic, and moral. Negative and positive traditions or rituals are perpetuated as part of a system to maintain social order. What we're seeing today is a shift in who's going to control this democracy and the social order. Radcliffe Brown surmised the traditions remain in existence to operate certain fundamental social values, and those social values are ever shifting. Sigmund Freud, on the other hand, he was the founder of psychoanalytic school of psychiatry. He believed the nature of taboo stemmed from ambivalent social attitudes. Anything forbidden must be something desired, and there is no need to prohibit something that no one wants. Freud acknowledged there was no generally accepted explanation of taboos, but proposed wide acceptance that taboos currently in any society are associated with objects and actions, again, significant for social order and a part of the general system of social control. So the taboos always set up guideposts and guidelines for controlling any given society, whether it's primitive, whether it's developed or whatever. It's always going to manifest itself to maintain that social order. And we're seeing it today with the rapidly changing states and the legislation that is setting up new prohibitions and reforms. Next slide, please. So taboo, what is the nature and characteristics of taboo? Next. In my research, I developed 5 key elements: the circle of power and generational influence, social order and societal control, ambivalent social attitudes, consequences of transgression, and sustainability. These elements enabled me to be able to go in and really examine the life and the nature and characteristics of the taboo interracial relationship of ER and Ann. The findings reveal how the research subjects created a sustainable relationship despite enduring taboo-breaking consequences, disruption of the social order and societal control, and ambivalent social attitudes of the study period. When social order and societal control in a given society are disrupted, members of the society formulate ambivalent attitudes, social attitudes toward the taboo breaker or the taboo breakers in this case. As a result, the taboo breaker consequently, their relationship either sustains or it dissolves over time. And if it sustains, it's because of this established please. And the next. I'm going to look at those simultaneously. The circle of power and generational influence. I conducted a historical multi-generational study using documents in my possession and literature, including the decade-long research study of my husband's white cousin, Ellen Robbins Redd, presented earlier in her book, The Early Days and Times on the Bayou, the letters of Horace Dickinson Taylor. The study began in England with William Taylor, it moved from William Taylor to Reverend Edward Taylor, who was born in 1642 in England, and his second wife, Ruth Willis Haynes. She was of nobility. Her mother and her father were both born in England, both noble, and her father was the governor, Governor John Haynes of Connecticut. And they had a daughter, Keziah Stiles, that we'll talk about in just a few. So we can go on. I'm not going to talk about all of the generations because we're talking, oh my goodness, we're talking back up just one. We're talking about the great grandparents of my research subjects, but we're going to start with Reverend Edward Taylor. Reverend Edward Taylor is the first Taylor to emerge and set roots in New England. He's the first one on American soil. And this is the 4-time great-grandfather of E.R. Taylor. It would be my husband's 5-time great-grandfather. He landed in New England, from England to New England, because he refused to subscribe to the 1662 Act of Uniformity. And that act was an act of Parliament of England that prescribed the form of public prayers and the administration of sacraments and the rites of the established Church of England, as prescribed by the Book of Common Prayer. And this was a requirement for all ministers if they were going to undergo Episcopal ordination. And so this led to this great exodus from England, and over 2,000 clergymen refused to take the oath. And this is where I find the first real act of open rebellion and just refusing and doing what the Taylors had always done, just what they thought was best. And there were generations and generations of ministers. And so that field or that career was passed from one to the next to the next. They were all Puritan ministers and politicians. And his good fortune, when he landed in New England, he landed at the doorstep of Harvard. And so he was asked to enroll in Harvard, and he was an outstanding student. And he went on to make a difference in New England, because at that time, the rampant drunkenness in New England was one of the most significant concerns of his. And so he organized the temperance movement and established the Temperance Society. Next. Here's the grandson of the Reverend Edward Taylor, born in 1727. And Dr. Ezra Stiles went on to be the president of Yale. You know, so we're starting to set up this educational line of descent and academic embracing of intellectual capabilities. Next. This is the father of Captain Edward Willis Taylor, born in 1814, is the father of E.R. Taylor, and he's known as the Texas Trailblazer. He was born in Sunderland, Massachusetts. He married a young socialite, Carolyn Betsy Porter. Caroline was her name, even though it was spelled Caroline. She was born to a very prominent merchant in Wilmington, Delaware, Alexander Porter. And this is where the exposure to slavery came into being in Wilmington, Delaware. And so E.W. Taylor, he became known as a high risk taker. He didn't want to have anything to do with formalized religion, but even though he practiced, so he and his wife's adventurous friend, surveyor John Root, and their 2-month-old daughter Rosalie took this journey to the Republic of Texas in 1838. And we can go to the next slide. When he got to Texas in 1838, it was still the Republic of Texas, and he took the oath of allegiance to the Republic. And this document was found among the treasure trove of evidence that I used in my research. Next, please. He was also a member of the Grand Lodge of Texas, of the Republic of Texas. And that was where he got to know everybody who was anybody. So this is starting to set up his circle of power and friends, but he also maintained his circle of friends from Delaware, New York, New England, the Carolinas, and this kind of thing. When he got here, originally he was supposed to have been going to Houston, but the mosquitoes were too bad. I get it. And so he went on into the interior of Texas and then Independence, Waco, Texas. And again, he met a Judge Coles that gave him land and gave him opportunity because he was recruiting forward thinkers into that part of Texas. And so he stayed there until 1848. And at that particular time, he had started to amass huge amounts of real estate in Brazoria, Harris, Fort Bend County, Galveston, and Washington counties. And he started a cotton commission business and later sold that business to his brother, Horace, who became the 20th mayor of Houston. Next, please. This is Horace. When you are influential, you set that society, that control up real well. His brother came with him. They both came to make a name for themselves. And so Horace took over the cotton business, cotton exchange business. And then he became the 20th mayor. Next slide, please. Another one of his influential circle of power and influence was William Marsh Rice. William Marsh Rice was the founder of Rice Institute, which today is known as Rice University. That's probably about 10, 15 minutes from my house. William Marsh Rice, he chartered Rice in 1871 exclusively for white students, a policy that remained in place until 1965. The school briefly allowed for the creation of the Ku Klux Klan student chapter. And so in 2022, with all of the uprisings and protests, the students of color insisted that they remove his statue from the campus. It was in such a prominent place. They didn't remove it completely, but they relocated it to another location. Rice was a major slave owner, and he and E.W. were slave traders in the Houston, Galveston area. Next, please. Ebenezer B. Nichols was another merchant and business partner of E.W. Taylor. Born in Cooperstown, New York, he traveled specifically to the Republic of Texas to bring a load of lumber in 1838. And so he met Rice and he met Taylor. And so three of them together operated a mercantile firm, a large import business that supplied plantations and settlers with dry goods, groceries, hardware, crockery, and enslaved people that came from New Orleans and New York. He owned 6 enslaved people himself. He was a captain in the Galveston Rifles. and converted his home on the Strand to the Armory, where it became headquarters for General John B. Magruder, serving on his staff as a financial agent for the Confederacy. Next. Another friend in their circle was Colonel William Lewis Moody, Sr. of Galveston, Texas. He was an American entrepreneur born in Essex County, Virginia. Founded the Moody Dynasty. Anyone that's ever been to Texas knows about the Moody Dynasty in Galveston, Texas. He participated in the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. And he was noted for persuading the federal and local governments to dredge Galveston's harbor, which led to Galveston becoming a prominent shipping port in the 19th century. Next, please. This is their mansion, the Moody Mansion. It's still there today, and it's open for tours. So you can pretty much see the kind of wealth. And even today, the Moody's are very prominent in the Galveston area. Next, please. Social order and societal control during slavery, the Civil War, and after slavery during Reconstruction. Next. Anne George. She was purchased July 16, 1856. Next. These were her, this is her slave papers, and she was purchased for $950 from a man by the name of William Patrick. On her slave papers, it said that she was a Negro woman. She was a servant and a cook, about 25 to 29 years old. Major and I did further research. We located her gravestone, and it indicated that she was not 25 to 29 years old. She was only 11 years old, 6 months older than E.R. Taylor, and they lived in and grew up in the same household. Next, please. Now we have Edward Ruthven Taylor. Ruthven was the name of a dear friend who was in the Masonic Lodge with his father, E.W. That's where he got the Ruthven name. And of course, by naming him Ruthven, that gave the father even more favor in the eyes of the Houston elite. Next. Because schools were not developed, E.R. Taylor in his early years went to Williston Seminary in East Hampton, Massachusetts. I found this document. It's dated 1921, 3 years before he passed away, where he made a contribution to Williston, and I called Williston to see if it was still in existence, and it's in existence. I was able to, from their archivist, get a 4-page autobiography, handwritten autobiography, which was very compelling, that Edward wrote. Next. He left Williston. He was at Williston in 1862. He left after his second year. The Civil War broke out. This is his Civil War record that I have indicating that he was in the Civil War. And next. He fought in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and then that's well documented from records as well. Next, please. E.R. was captured while he was there by Ulysses S. Grant, July 4th, 1863. Next. So he was released to come back home, but he was a physical wreck. And so as a result of him being very sick, his father gave him Ann Taylor, the slave. Next. Social order, societal control. Let me talk about that for a minute. Negative and positive rites, rituals, and traditions establish specific fundamental social values as part of the system by which society maintains order and control. White legislators feared and stressed that race mixing would become contagious and dangerous to society. So evidence today, we see that today coming into play with white replacement theory and critical race theory. James and John Taylor both believed in maintaining white supremacy and keeping their bloodline pure, and by marrying their cousins. Anti-miscegenation laws were enacted across the nation to ensure the integrity and purity of the white race. The study examined the nature and characteristic of E.R. and Ann Taylor's relationship at a critical time when Texas and the United States laws prohibited miscegenation, also known as race mixing and amalgamation. The term miscegenation emerged during Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas' presidential campaign in 1864 during the raging Civil War. Northern opponents used that. Northern opponents of Lincoln attempted to provoke outrage and mislead white public opinion by publishing and distributing a pamphlet to suggest Lincoln and his Republican Party supported interracial marriage. History shows that Lincoln was of mixed race, and so they used that against him. To control interracial relationships, white Texans endorsed legal segregation and extended the law to include a ban on interracial marriage in 1858. However, only a few cases actually came to trial before the courts declared the law invalid in 1877. Several years later, the Texas legislature adopted a new act in 1882, forbidding all interracial sexual relations. The General Assembly, I find this interesting. The General Assembly, so you see different states doing different things as we're watching that take place today across the land. The General Assembly of Virginia passed the infamous Racial Integrity Act of 1924, criminalizing interracial marriage in Virginia. I chose to defend my dissertation in Virginia because of this. The act, designed to maintain white supremacy, made it unlawful for any white person to marry any non-white person. The provisions of the law required the issuance of a racial registration certificate at birth and strict definitions of who would belong to the white race. In 1967, the landmark case, which you've heard of Loving versus Virginia, the United States Supreme Court declared the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 unconstitutional. Richard Loving, a white man, and Mildred Dolores Jeter, a Negro woman, residents of Virginia, were legally married in Washington, D.C. in 1958, which wasn't that long ago. When the Lovings returned to Virginia, they were arrested for violating the state's Racial Integrity Act. The Supreme Court's unanimous decision in the Loving case overturned state anti-miscegenation statutes throughout the United States. So, having said that, to maintain the social order of the Taylors in Houston, L.B. Moody, the prominent son of who we saw earlier, W.L. Moody, did all the drafting of documents for E.R. Taylor to make sure that those that legally motions of control to maintain social order protected the white family as well as the Black family. And as the executor of the E.R. Taylor estate, L.B. Moody provided a smooth transition of the E.R. Taylor estate in his last will, and it stated, "I leave to the children of Anne, a woman who has lived with me." He didn't say my wife, "a woman who has lived with me, my estate," and proceeded Anne preceded ER in death, and upon her death, the children of Anne already owned 50% of the estate. Before passing away, my mother-in-law, Mollie Taylor Stevenson Sr., shared memories of the day that ER and Ann Taylor died. She, at that time, was 13 years old, and she recanted the white family of ER coming to Pierce Junction in a limousine, arriving and ordered the adult children of ER and Ann Taylor to vacate the property. ER's children immediately called L.B. Moody and their good father's friend, Milt Gieselman, who maintained the secrecy of the relationship. And they told the children, you didn't have to go anywhere. Next. So in 1870, to maintain the social order in downtown Houston and not disturb the friendships and the business partnerships that EW had, he helped to move them out of downtown to Pierce Junction on 640 acres, and ER Taylor paid for that land. It was only $1 an acre, $640. Next, please. And the 1870 census validates the fact that he did move, and they at that particular time, and they had to move. Let me back up. They had to move because during the course of his healing, Anne became pregnant, and so that is what disturbed the social order. So they had to leave the family home, and so his father gave him 2 Negro boys to help farm the land, and they went out there with their 3/12, which is 3-month-old mulatto infant named Pinky. And at this particular time, ER and Ann were 25. They both were 25 years old, because I said earlier they were 6 months apart. Next, please. So legally, since slavery had ended, as a free woman, Anne could have sought assistance from the Freedmen's Bureau of Texas to relocate. Again, that's only about 15 minutes from where I live on the ER and Ann Taylor estate. The Freedmen's Bureau issued contracts to formerly enslaved people that established a 10-hour workday, Monday through Friday, and labor on Saturdays. Formerly enslaved people received quarters, fuel, food, medical care, land for a garden, monthly wages that ranged from $2 to $15 a month, with 2 to 5 most common, and remained in the household as a paid. She had to be paid, and this is a ledger that documents what her salary was that ER Taylor kept. So part of the secret life and the isolation and the cover-up of their relationship was paid wages, but with employee benefits, sexual benefits. Next. So according to the white relatives and George, this situation created a major Houston scandal. Next. We talk about ambivalent social attitudes. The ambivalence was she a domestic servant, paid? Were they in a marriage? Were they in a common law marriage? You know, black, white, mulatto, the children were mixed up. You know, they didn't know if they were black, white, mulatto, or whatever. You know, so they didn't fit in the black community, and they definitely weren't going downtown to ER and Caroline's home because they were not socially accepted. Next, please. This shows evidence that Anne at some point in time was considered, this is 1917, she died. This is after she passed away. This is a receipt from the city of Houston for property taxes that indicates Mrs. It says, I did a close examination, it says Mrs. and Mrs. Mrs. E.R. Taylor and their address. So that documents the fact that she considered herself, and he considered privately, that she was actually his wife, but could never state it publicly. Next, please. So as I said earlier, there are going to be consequences anytime that you engage in anything taboo. The consequences for E.R. and Ann Taylor were positive and negative. During their lifetime, the first consequence for their transgression was that they had to leave the family home. They were thrust out into the woods, dark, dreary woods. They had to learn how to be farmers, the whole nine. So they continued to live out there, and they lived for 39 years. And the study revealed this forced isolation and that consequence. And they had to conceal their sexual relationship, again, because sex between slave masters and their slaves or former slaves, there were heavy prices to pay for that. It was the cover up, again, was her wages. And another consequence that they suffered was the fact that when she passed away, she could not be buried in the white cemetery because of Jim Crow laws that were enacted to make sure that society and the social structure remained. Next, please. A good consequence for Anne was that in 1903, E.R. Taylor deeded to her half of his 640 acres. Next. L.B. Moody again, he drafted Ann Taylor's deed to get around the miscegenation laws. Next. Another good consequence was the discovery of oil on the property that created quite a stir. So their secret, isolated existence suddenly was going to be uncovered. Because Anne owned half of the E.R. Taylor property, she signed the first exploration lease in January 1st, 1901 with Howard Hughes Sr., none other than. Next. She also had a will, her last will and testament. It was signed, she could read and write. Her children taught her to read and write. Her son, Major M.J. Taylor, and he witnessed it and she signed it. And this was later drafted up in another format by the Moody's. Next. And she also had an estate account, a bank account that E.R. Taylor kept for her estate. Next. She died July 26, 1909, but this receipt indicates that she also had access to the family's doctor, Dr. Norsworthy. He submitted a bill to ER for his services after she passed away. Next. And in her death notice, it indicated, again, this ambivalence. Privately, but now publicly in the Black newspaper, she was referred to as Mrs. Anna Taylor. And it clearly stated that she was the wife. She said that she was survived by her husband and her 6 children. So that is another indication that in her world, in her Black world, she was a prominent citizen. In the white world, the ambivalence was that she was never ever able to go back to the white Taylor family home. Her children, when E.R. Taylor's mother passed away, never acknowledged her, gave everything that she owned to her nieces and nephews because E.R. Taylor, in her mind, did not have any children. Next. Next, please. So she was buried on the property. That's her grave site. Today, that grave site is located in 26 acres that the descendants of E.R. and Ann Taylor donated to the city of Houston to preserve the heritage, the history, the story. And so another consequence was that she could not be buried in the white cemetery, but she had to be buried right there on the home site behind the house. Next. E.R. Taylor, on the other hand, he always traveled, but a consequence for their relationship was he could never, because of Jim Crow, he could never travel with his Black children or his Black common law wife. But he traveled abroad. He went to the World's Fair. He just loved travel. And today, the generations have been exposed to that, and they love to travel. It's a generational influence. Next. So after she died, he kind of started hanging out more, but he never ever lost touch with his good buddies, his white friends. They hung out, they traveled together to various places. And next, you'll see a document that shows that he died July 19th of 1924 of an enlarged prostate. Next. He, of course, could be buried in the family plot in the beautiful Glenwood Cemetery, historic cemetery in Houston. But one of the things that we discovered during the research was that we had been to the family plot many times, huge monuments there. But this particular time, we discovered that there was no marker for E.R. Taylor. This was a negative consequence that he suffered. Although the family came and got his body, they put him in the family plot, but they never gave him a marker. So in 2014, we held a ceremony at Glenwood Cemetery and had a Confederate reenactment. Thank God it was before all of the removal of these Confederate markers. But anyway, that's again that ambivalence. Do you acknowledge as a Black person the history of your great-great-great-great-grandparents? Do you acknowledge their involvement in the Confederacy? Because this opened up a whole nother conversation for the descendants of E.R. Taylor who are Black to become members of the Daughters and Sons of the Republic and the Daughters and Sons of the Confederacy and the American Revolution. So that ambivalence still remains many generations later. Next, please. Sustainability. It's no question that they sustain their relationship. I asked the critical question through research, looking at least 5 years of records from the census, just to see how he answered the census question about marriage. He never, ever answered that question yes until Anne died. He finally said in 1910 census, he finally said, "I'm married." Next, please. The Taylor legacy is sustained today. It's alive and well. 7 generations later, 152 years, the descendants, 7 families, still live on the property. Next. This is all of his children, a good consequence. They were among the first African Americans in Texas to receive a formal education. Pinky, the firstborn, went to Tillotson Institute where I taught for about 5 years. She graduated in 1890. She came back to be a farmer and rancher to help her dad because he had expanded the farm so drastically that he actually needed help. Next, please. She lived to be 106 years old. Next. Another son, Samuel, born in 1874, he rode horseback to a public school that's located on the site now in the Texas Medical Center. He attended Tillotson College as well, and also Hampton Institute in Hampton, Virginia, and an electrical school in Chicago. Next. Nettie Caroline. She attended school in Seguin, Texas, came back, farmer, rancher. She went to Guadalupe College. Next. Major Julius Taylor also went to Tillotson College, farmer, rancher, a lot of farming, ranching. This is who my husband Major is named after. Next. He was a world traveler. He was exposed to world travel and the stories that his father would always tell when he come back from his travels. And so I saw a letter that he had written while he was in college to his father. The letters always privately said, ended with affectionately your father. And so ER got a major passport, and that's when his travels started. Next. Then we have his wife. There's Mollie, their only child. She was the first grandchild of ER and Ann Taylor. Next. And we have Dr. William Edward Taylor. He also went to Tillotson College, but got his medical degree at Meharry Medical in Nashville. Next. Bert Taylor. Bert Taylor was a jeweler and he was in optometry as well. So he had a business downtown on San Felipe. And so the influence of being around, seeing these white entrepreneurs coming in and out of his father's home, that kind of left a mark on him as well. Next. So he attended Tillotson again, also Bradley Polytech in Peoria, and he was the first Black jeweler in Texas and optometrist. And he owned, his company name was Bert F. Taylor and Company. Next. I just acknowledge again all the people that were with me on my journey. I didn't mention Dr. Dottie Aga, spelled wrong, Gupta, forgive me, and Dr. Martin Malosi, who was a public history expert at University of Houston. And thank everyone for coming. And what I will do now is, I suppose, open up for some questions. I'm just so glad to see so many familiar faces, but one person that I would like to unmute is Dr. John Stanfield, who will also be making comments and answering questions.
Hello, Dr. Beverly Stevenson.
Hello, Dr. Stanfield. How are you today?
It's a wonderful, wonderful experience to be here with you and with all of my colleagues and friends at Fielding. Blessings to all of you. Greetings from Mauritius. And thank you right now for bringing back such not just precious memories, but important memories and recognition the need for us to understand the tragedies of taboo. But at the same time, from the standpoint of the special mission of fielding, to understand how it is that we can do this sort of extraordinary data-driven research, which is so deeply historically grounded and has such contemporary value. I have a question for you, though. How does all of this relate to what's going on in this day and age in regards to the white nationalist concern about the so-called Great Replacement? What is that all about in relation to this horrible need on their part to stop what they consider to be the breaching of taboo when it comes to the changing demographics of this country of ours?
Again,
Thank you very much.
yeah. Again, it's that objectified fear of others, xenophobia, fear of losing the social order and the social control. We used to hear a lot about New World Order. We're in it. We're in the middle of it. The whole world is shifting to a New World Order. And it's a little scary. You know, that fear is a fear on both sides of the fence. It's a fear that a race of people who have been oppressed, suppressed, depressed for a very long time have finally moved to a position of power and influence, power and generational influence, because now we've seen it, we know what it feels like, we know what it looks like. Many of us were first generation college students, but what they don't understand is that we're not the same people that I talked about earlier in Taboo. We are people who are woke, you know, and so to take us back to a time of prohibition, all these prohibitions, now all you hear is anti this and anti that. It's social order and control. It's a power thing as to who's going to control this democracy. And if I can't control it, I'm going to tear it up. I'm going to destroy it, literally. You know, so that's what we're faced with. Are there any other questions?
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure, thank you. I think the one thing that I can say, there's so much objectified fear that if we do not get a grip, and if we do not understand what's going on, and hopefully today's presentation will help you to understand better the emerging or the attempts to create new emerging taboos. That is what we're looking at, new emerging taboos. And we can stop it. We have to stop it. We all must use all of our resources and power to vote. And that's the only major weapon that we have right now.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. I see Dr. Dorothy Gupta has her hand up and would like to either make a comment or ask a question.
Well, hi, Beverly. I will make a comment and two comments. First of all, and I broke out, I'm ready to cry with this, but I just think that Major would be so proud of you today.
Don't make me cry.
I know. Those of you may not know that my first encounter with Beverly and Major was a fielding session where they talked about this little tiny town in Massachusetts, Sunderland, which is where my immigrant parents, grandparents lived and still do. My sister still lives there. And racism is alive and well in this little town. And then I really appreciate your presentation and your dissertation, because I think that you're going into something that is so deep and so real. And that taboo is something that when I lived in Lexington, Kentucky, I had to hide in the back seat of the car with a blanket over me.
I bet you did.
All those things. And at the same time, my grandmother would walk out of the room if one of my Black friends came into the house. So it's rampant. And we talk about lots of the visible things, but we don't often talk about how deeply ingrained it is in the parents and grandparents who are bringing up children, and how deeply perpetuating this is. And so your dissertation is addressing something, and your presentation today is addressing something that is quite often overlooked, and that is the deep pervasiveness of the taboos, and how challenging it is, I think, for each one of us to look deep inside at our own taboos that we still hold on to. And there's a huge challenge there. So thank you very much. And you're marvelous, Beverly.
Thank you. When I completed this work 10 years ago, who knew? You know, today the relevance of it speaks so loudly. You know, I concluded by saying the last major taboo, I was so naive, the last major taboo in the United States is that of same-sex marriage. Well, shortly after that, same-sex marriage became illegal, but everything that is legal now there's an attempt to make it unlegal, you know, and go back from whence it came. Is that Barbara Meek?
There's a couple of hands up. I see Bianca Norris and Betty Roberts.
How about you, Betty? Let's start with you. Betty, can you unmute?
All right, I'm done.
Hey.
I got it.
Okay.
How are you?
I'm
That was
great.
excellent. That was excellent.
Thank you. Thank
So
you.
what's your engagement in continuing the historical quest related to the Taylors, and I mean, are you still engaged in data gathering, research? Where are you? Where do things stand 10 years later?
Well, for 10 years, I would say that I've been more of a practitioner than a scholar. I've been maintaining the role of president of the Mollie Taylor Stevenson Senior Heirs FLP, a family partnership to preserve the land and the legacy. I've been more of a practitioner, but this event has brought me back to being my scholarly self. Thank y'all. And I felt like I had dissertation PTSD.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And it looks like we'll just take one more because we are at time. Bianca, you've had your hand up for quite some time.
Unmute, please. Bianca, can you unmute?
Yes, ma'am. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to say thank you so much for an intriguing presentation. But my question is, this abject fear that you speak of, do you get a sense that this is spreading globally? And if so, can you expound on that a little bit?
Well, I try not to oversaturate myself by watching the news. But with the war going on in Ukraine and Russia and all the things that are going on in Europe right now, with white nationalism on the rise, Of course, it's always been there, you know, it's never gone anywhere. But it's getting louder and louder and louder, and it's spreading. And Donald Trump did not make it any better with his last 4 or 5 years of nonsense, you know. And so, yes, this country needs prayer, and it also needs activism. You know, I just believe that when President Obama took office, we were so proud, you know, we were so happy, but all of this is still backlash. This is backlash. All this is about setting us all the way back, you know. But I think that there are enough people out there who are knowledgeable, who are listening, who are watching, who are acting, who are marching and I think it's enough people out there not to allow the country to be totally destroyed and demolished, and certainly not take civil rights all the way back to square one.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. Barbara, I notice you have a comment, and as a mentor, we'll give you that space. And then Dr. Taylor, if you could close us out with some closing thoughts after Dean Mink, that would be wonderful. Dean Mink?
Yes, mine is not a question. It's just, a gratefulness, Beverly, for you having the opportunity to present your research again and to tell this marvelous story. The other thing I want to just comment on for people who are in the space at Fielding and other places is the linkages that we have developed at Fielding. I'm just thinking here, Beverly, of you and your husband, Major, being at my home in Austin, you kind of adopting my son, John, and interested in what he's doing. And then what some folks don't realize is that Beverly went through the new student orientation and we had to abruptly end it because that Tuesday was 9/11. And we had to close down the whole new student orientation. And she and I guess 2 other women, got in a car.
Thank you.
And we drove the whole distance back to Texas together. And there was one morning that was just profound in my mind, which just brings us together. And that's that sunrise.
Yeah, yeah.
And you and I were the only 2 people, I think, awake in the car.
Yes.
And there's this huge red ball as we're coming into the sunrise in Texas. We're over near El Paso. The sun is rising and the radio is slowly playing America.
Yeah, it was surreal.
And it was just a surreal time that has forever bound us as friends, as colleagues, as sisters. Yes. So this has been just a wonderful journey and I look forward to many more years, Beverly.
Thank you. Thank you. I do too.
Dr. Taylor?
Okay, I think that we have allowed everyone a chance to speak and want to thank Dr. Stevenson for her riveting presentation. There are linkages. I'm so glad you, Dr. Mink, mentioned them. One of which I think we should mention is that Houston Tillotson College, which university now that you mentioned, is an affiliate institution of a program that we're running now at Fielding.
Oh, so that's wonderful.
So we have an HT, as they call it now, connection. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you.
I think as we close out today and we celebrate and recognize the significance of Juneteenth, that we should be reminded of the quote that's attributed to the great American philosopher, George Santayana: "Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it." Thank you all for being here today. Thank you again, Dr. Stevenson, for your remarks.
Thank you.
And we'll look forward again to continuing this work in the weeks, months, and years ahead. Thank you and good day.
Thank you. I see so many people. Hey, Laura. Oh my goodness, Kimberly. Oh my goodness, who else? Alice. Oh, Jeremy, oh my God. Yeah, I just see everybody. Oh Lord, this is wonderful. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Joyce.